Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. My name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm your host and the founder of the Epics Hour. And today's topic is the communication. That is the seventh section of the CTA. And we have a Salesforce CTA, Lilith, with us. So let me hand over her for her presentation and introduction. Hand over to you.
Thank you so much. So yes, I would love to talk today about the communication, the 7th CTA section. And I am Lilith van Biesen, so I'm a solution architect. I'm also a Salesforce certified technical architect. And I think when I was discussing with Amit, okay, which parts of the CTA might be interesting to go into, the communication part for me seemed to be one that actually did not receive so much attention so far. And it's also a bit of a tricky one to know, okay, what am I getting into? So I hope this is going to be an insightful session. I have the following topics for you. So first, I will go over the evaluation criteria. So what does Salesforce expect? What do they mention with regard to communication in the exam guide? How can you find your style? What are some pointers there? What audience do you need to keep in mind? Then which techniques might help you improve, and how are we bringing this all together when we are then actually going into the presentation and the Q&A? So diving into the first part, which are the evaluation criteria, we see here that the 2 bullets that are mentioned there mention that you have to articulate the benefits, limitations, considerations, and design choices for a solution architecture and handle objections related to the design. You also should demonstrate how visualization and documentation tools can be used to articulate the technical solution. And then finally, you have to demonstrate the ability to handle unexpected roadblocks and determine the appropriate next steps. So, okay, what does this really mean? Well, the first ones that I highlighted in purple, I believe are related to more of the presentation part. So when we're talking about these benefits, limitations, considerations, design choices, these are when you have, for example, a requirement, let's say you need to have a form on your website where people can indicate that they have interest in a certain tool that you have or a certain product or service that you're selling. Okay, so that might be a particular requirement. So what solution, what design choice do you put forth? So for example, you can say, okay, Web2Lead actually fits this quite well, but there are some limitations to be mentioned there. So one of the limitations for Web2Lead, we know that you can only create 500 leads per day via Web2Lead. We have queues, etc. But that is one of the limitations to be kept in mind. So what were the considerations? Well, I did consider perhaps going with a custom form or using an app exchange product, such as, for example, form assembly. However, in this case, I think that within the limitations, we can really stay within that 500 per day. So that's why I went with this particular solution. So that is the part that the first aspect mentions. And then the visualization part, of course, we have our artifacts, which is really what this is about, in my opinion, and really leveraging them to make sure that they fully convey what your solution will do, how it will work, and how it will relate to the other aspects, for example, other systems that are there, is really the strength that you have to bring in this communication part. Now the blue things, so the blue text, handle objections, handle unexpected roadblocks, and the next steps, these relate more to the Q&A part, where you are making certain assumptions, as I did in my example as well, right? I said, okay, I'm assuming there's only 500 leads per day max going via the Web2Lead form. Maybe they challenge that. Maybe they say, no, there will definitely be more. So how do I handle that unexpected roadblock? And what are the next steps there? Will I go then with this form assembly solution? That is the part that you have to be prepared for when you go into the Q&A part. So, but let's first talk about the style. So I think, important disclaimer here is that in this session, I will walk you through some of the insights or tips and tricks that I have and that I heard about and I want to share with you all. But it is important that you find your own style and approach, because when you are going for the review board, as you can imagine, there's a lot of pressure on you. It's a very stressful situation. And if you don't have a style that is really yours, that you feel comfortable with, that comes natural, then I think it will be very difficult to really pull it off and stay calm and cool and collected during the day. So my proposal is you can get feedback, which is always the most valuable thing when you're going for a CTA, and use that feedback to tweak your style, try minor changes, do a test run again, do a mock again, see if it really works, if it helped you. And then through this trial and error, you will find actually the style that works best for you in the end. So that is my approach to finding your style and the advice that I would give there. Now, who is the audience? So, well, we know that they expect you to kind of present for a C-level audience. And we know that these are the CTA judges. There's a panel of CTAs. So, you know, actually they have quite a strong technical background, but that doesn't mean that you have to give a technical presentation. I think quite the opposite. You have to be really careful here that you don't lose track of what is the business process. You are talking to a company about a solution that will, you know, be used by a very broad group of users. So going into only the technical details is not what they want. They don't want to have the best developer or the best technical person. They want to have someone who has a broad view, who knows that this can be a solution that is really going to solve their problem in a very scalable way, but also, as I mentioned here, is going to be user-friendly, and it will solve it end-to-end. We're not thinking of Salesforce as an island. We are really considering Salesforce in the broader architecture of what they will be using. So to sum it up, I think they're looking for an architect who is reliable and robust. So this means that you will go there, you will present something, you will tell us what were some of the considerations or assumptions. Why did you go for this particular solution, and are you sure it will hold up? You want to have an architect who is complete. They didn't miss anything there. The solution is end-to-end. It all makes sense. It's a puzzle that fits nicely together. Yet they are able to bring it in a very concise way. Because if you think about it, 45 minutes is really not that much when you have to convey all that information. So you have to really be concise. And then the final bullet, I think, is actually the most important one. And let me start with the proactive part. So you want to have someone who is proactive, who looks at this scenario and who knows that these are some of the risks that we can have, or there is some information missing there. And I think really where you shine, or where you can really show that you think end-to-end, that you have this helicopter view, that you are proactive, is by making the right, highlighting the right risks, making the right assumptions, and proposing a correct and good LDV strategy, showing that you know where those areas are, where are the risks associated with this particular project, and how can we solve them or mitigate these risks at least. And then the flexible part, that is really more in the Q&A, I think, that you will encounter this. So as I mentioned already before, they will likely challenge you. They will likely throw a wrench in some of your planning, in some of your assumptions that you made. So you have to be flexible. You don't have to, change immediately. You don't have to cave if they say maybe that is not the best solution. You might have a very good reason to go with this solution, which might not be optimal. So you are completely okay with justifying that. But if you see that actually it does make sense to change, you are also adapt to do this, and you can actually make this change. You are flexible enough to do this. Now, some of the considerations, some of the challenges for the audience. Well, the judges, they are multitasking, right? Because they are listening to, they're really trying to understand what you're talking about. But on the other hand, they're also taking notes. They're, trying to understand what is there. They're looking at your artifacts. So they're really making sure that they understand what you say, but they also want to make sure they have notes to ask questions later, give you feedback, and that they look at your artifacts and really understand how does this work. So that is a big challenge, because you talk nonstop for 45 minutes. It's not as if they can interrupt you to say, hey, wait a minute, can you go back to that point? I didn't get that. That's not the way that the review board works. It's really kind of a 45-minute monologue. And well, this 45-minute, that's a very long duration to pay attention. I'm sure you will notice in this session that, I will talk for a bit and then it's difficult to really pay attention to everything that I'm saying. Maybe I said something that made you think of something else and you started your own train of thought, or maybe you were taking notes, or maybe you got a message here or there. There's a lot of things that can distract you, and 45 minutes is a long time to pay attention to it. Anything really. On the other hand, it is a very short time to cover everything that you need to. And also, you don't really have time to practice this presentation. You get the scenario, you solve it, and then you immediately go in to present the solution. So it's really a very tricky situation, a very difficult balance. And then most of us are non-native speakers. English is not our first language, which means we may run into issues when reading the scenario. We might be a bit slower in reading it, or we might not know all the words. Maybe there's some jargon being used that we're not familiar with. So that is definitely something that can be challenging. And also finding the words when you're presenting or when you are answering questions can be very challenging. So I have a few possible solutions that we can use here. So how do we deal with multitasking judges? Well, I think if you use storytelling, it is easier to keep their focus, or for them to jump out and jump back in without losing track. Sometimes I see people who present requirements per requirement without really telling it as a story and really thinking about the business process behind it. And then if you look away, you kind of missed half of what they were saying. So you lost track of where they are exactly. So using storytelling, you create kind of a red thread throughout the presentation, which they can more easily jump back into, because now they know, okay, you're talking about the onboarding. I may have jumped out for a moment, but now I see that we are talking about the initial driver license upload or whatever. And it's still part of the onboarding process, just the next step. With regard to getting or retaining their attention, I find that using some visual and auditory variation can help. So for example, using those artifacts to have a bit of a visual mix. Of course, in the beginning, you will just walk through the artifacts, which will have or will offer a lot of variation already. But then you come to arguably the biggest part of the presentation, which is going through all these requirements one by one, which if you just look at the scenario, you're kind of staring at a wall of text. And that can, that's not that stimulating to look at. So there, I think if you can sometimes really jump back to some of the artifacts that you use. Usually we present them side to side. So for example, you're talking about a particular requirement, maybe link it to the data model, maybe enforce the solution that you had, maybe, emphasize that this makes sense, because as you can see in the data model, we do have a lead and it will become an account contact and opportunity later. So you can really use it to make sure that there is some variation there. Also with regard to the intonation, I think there, if you're not reading out loud, it will already help a lot. And if you're not, going in a very monotonous way from requirement solution, I think it will also help a lot. And usually storytelling, when you tell a story, you're trying to be engaging, you're trying to really emphasize certain words, which I think help also in keeping the attention of the judges. And then the final part that I think you can do with regard to this attention span issue, let's say, is kind of introduce the end-to-end first. So as I mentioned in the previous example, we're talking, for example, about customer onboarding. So you can say, okay, so a customer will go to a particular page, they will give some of their information, they will walk through kind of a wizard where they enter a few steps, we check with a few external systems to validate some of that information. And then you can jump into the second layer, which is the technical detail. How will you actually do this? Well, the page that I mentioned, that is actually going to be a registration page. And this jumping to validation with the external system, that is actually integration number one. So if you kind of find a good balance, making sure that you introduce the context first, without immediately jumping into detail. This gives the judges a bit more room to follow what you're doing and also keep them engaged. With regard to the non-native speakers as myself, I think if you use more specific vocabulary, rather than leaning on these very vague words such as use, do, help, these we use a lot because they're easy and they're you know, they cover a lot of different ground, but they also become very monotonous. If you have to use make, I will make a lightning web component, I will make a call out. If you use that in a lot of different sentences very close to each other, it becomes repetitive and it, you know, distracts from what you're saying. Another thing that I think is very important that you're not hesitant on when you are a non-native speaker is you can clarify your doubts. It's absolutely fine if, for example, if someone asks a question and you're not really sure you understood it, it's better to just ask for clarification. Is this what you want me to talk about? Is this what you want me to clarify? Rather than assume that, oh yeah, I think they mean that, and waste time on talking through something that they don't really want to know or care about. So jumping into some techniques. I know that some of you will say maybe time management is not really a technique, it's more of a skill that you need to hone. But it is, I think, the key to really passing the CTA, because it's all so tight with regard to timing. The preparation is so tight, you don't have that much room also and time to actually go through the presentation. And then you immediately jump into the Q&A part. So you have to really see where can I steal some time so that I do have the room to focus on what I think is most important, and that I get everything into a nice format and show what I can do in this very, very tight time frame. So the first thing that I would advise is kind of keep track of your milestone times. When you're doing these practice runs, when you're doing these mocks, maybe you want to write down, okay, so during the presentation, the preparation, I needed 15 minutes this time for the read through, or maybe I needed 20 to read through the scenario for the very first time. That is maybe a bit much. Maybe I can bring it down. Maybe I can look at some fast learning techniques, fast reading techniques. How can I, you know, push that down? Maybe I already started thinking of solutioning while I first had to read through to get a good idea of what is there. With the artifacts, you can do the same. When did I draw the first artifacts? Even though maybe you haven't really solved it yet, you already know, okay, I will be using these systems, or I will be using at least these objects. Well, maybe I can refine that a bit more. Maybe I can push down the time there as well by not structuring it already, just creating post-its so that I know that these will be there, and structuring it later on when I have the full information. And the same, I think, counts for the presentation. When you are presenting, it's always nice to ask one of the judges during your mocks to keep your time, to keep those milestones, to tell you, hey, you spent 3 minutes on the system landscape and 4 on the role hierarchy. Well, maybe that's not the best way to spend your time or to allocate it, because for system landscape, of course, you need a lot more time because there's just way more on there. So maybe you can reduce some of the time for your role hierarchy and go in a bit more detail on elements of your system landscape. And then there's really no silver bullet or magic potion that can help you get to the end. You have to really practice and refine your style so it becomes natural. As I mentioned, there will be a lot of pressure. So it is best to really make sure that you've automated as much as you could, so that you go in, you know exactly how you will tackle this. You have your own style, you have your own approach and technique. So you know, if they ask about this, I can answer that. I feel confident that I can support or present and justify my solution. And then this is a very important one, is through practice, you will also create kind of a gut feeling. For me, one of the things that I lost a lot of time on when I was practicing was the data model. I was always second guessing, should I go standard? Should I go custom? I lost so much time. And this is something that if you don't decide this, yeah, you're kind of stuck, because good luck solving the rest of the scenario if, you know, if one of the basic foundational pieces is missing. So there, I really got more of a gut feeling. I make more split decisions really quick, like, okay, this is going to be a standard object. And I also am more comfortable in doing that right now because it doesn't have to be carved in stone. The Q&A really allows you to change your mind. The judges will come back if they see, okay, you're using the standard object, but did you fully consider the implications, for example, on your sharing? And then you have the Q&A to change your mind, but always, of course, before you change, keep in mind that you don't fall into the domino effect trap, let's say, right? When you change one thing, what will the implications be on the rest of the solution? If I go with a standard object, which sharing implications are there? If I change the relationship, for example, between some objects, what will the impact be? So that is always something to keep in mind when you change your mind. But when you're doing the preparation, make sure that you really hone that gut feeling that you get and that you know, okay, I'm comfortable with this. I will just move on. I will solve it. It will be a good solution. It might be suboptimal. I might have used a standard one, but I'm not going to wreck my brain over it now. I have too much other things to do. So this is what I'm going for. So breaking down some of the time managements, where can you save some time? Well, in the preparation, for example, your artifacts do not have to be works of art. This is tricky because if you are a perfectionist, then of course you want to make sure it's all nice, it's all clean, it's all very, very easy to understand, but you're under a time crunch. So I think the most important attributes of your artifacts are they clean? Not as in they have to be super, super perfect, but do they have any confusing scribblings on them? If so, then maybe, you know, refine that part because you don't want to have anything confusing on there. That's the second part, right? Are they clear? Are they too small? Can you enlarge them? Are they readable? Going into the next part, because that's really important. You can have awesome artifacts, but if the judges cannot read what you're writing there, they're, you know, not that useful, of course. For me personally, the way that I tackled my artifacts is, well, first of all, I practiced a lot in advance. So for example, I did a lot of drawing of data models, standard Salesforce data models, such as Sales Service Cloud, to make sure that I had that as very direct knowledge, let's say, that I could very easily apply. And also I used a format which for me was magnets and a whiteboard that I could very easily make changes to without having to start over. For example, if you write on paper and you have to move something, it becomes a kind of a mess and you might have to start from scratch. With my whiteboard approach, I didn't have to do that. So that saved me a lot of time. Then when you go into the presentation, always think, where does it make sense to go into detail? And where is this really just a waste of time? So this is very relevant, for example, for assumptions and considerations and the technical detail. In my example that I mentioned for Web to Lead, for example, I think there it is important to highlight some of the assumptions and considerations that you made, because they will make or break the solution. And you want to show that you did think about the bigger picture there, that you know exactly what the limitations are of the tool that you're proposing. On the other hand, for example, if you go with a screen-based flow, you might not need to go into detail about, okay, I did consider also standard and UI and Lightning Web Component, but in the end, I went for the screen-based flow. I think there, it might not be as relevant. It depends, of course, on the requirement, but overall, I think there you can more easily just say, okay, I went for a screen-based flow and it will do this or that. And then for the Q&A part, let me quote the magnificent Vanilla Ice. So stop, collaborate, and listen. So this is, I think, very, very important, because when we think about the Q&A and just the review board in general, we think about, okay, I need to show that I know everything as soon as possible because time will run out. So I need to answer quickly so that they know that I know, and then we can move on to the next question. I can do as many questions that I possibly can. I know that this is kind of the urge that you would have, and I had it too for sure, but it doesn't, you know, it can actually be detrimental or hinder you rather than help, in the sense that take a moment to really make sure that you understand the question and that you will be answering the question that they are asking, not the question that you think they might be asking. For example, they might ask you a question about reporting, but the actual thing they want to know is, if you run such a report, will this user actually see this information that they should see in the report? Maybe the issue is not with reporting. Maybe your issue is with the visibility and access. So really make sure that you understand what are they actually asking. Make sure also that you think about, how does this question relate to what is in the scenario? Maybe the scenario didn't specify this. Maybe they are adding this as an assumption. That's absolutely fine. That's, you know, they want to kind of throw unexpected requirements at you. So that can definitely happen. So really think about that as well. And you might feel, or you might fall into the trap of just repeating your solution, but make sure that if you do, that it really makes sense from what they asked. Just don't go into details where you don't have to. Keep it concise and just stop. Don't go on and on and on the way that I'm doing right now. Just, you know, get to the point, answer the question, and then leave room for follow-up. If you're not sure that you actually did answer the question, if you were not entirely sure what they were getting to, you can always ask, does that answer your question? They might not answer whether it did or it didn't, but at least, you know, you opened up, you left them room to follow up in case there was something that they wanted to have clarified. All right, moving on to the other techniques. Sorry, just to make sure I didn't miss a slide. There we go. So when you're thinking about the presentation contents, think about the slides and make sure that you write really only what is necessary there. Of course, your slides help you as well because they kind of refresh what should I mention in the overview part, what should I tackle in the risk and assumption part, etc. But if you write too much, you may fall into two traps. The first one is you might start reading out loud because there's a wall of text and you want to make sure you don't forget anything, which, as I mentioned before, is not that engaging to listen to. Or the judges may start reading it and then they might be reading rather than listening to you, which also is not exactly what you want to do because you might be adding a lot more detail than what you wrote down. But if there's a lot of text, this is just something that people tend to do. I know I do, definitely. If there's a lot of text, I just read what's there and I might zone out. Also know that a picture really is worth 1,000 words. So you might spend a lot of text on a particular topic, but again, a lot of text, if you want to put it on a slide, becomes very cluttered and very difficult to, you know, keep the focus on you as a speaker rather than your slides. So there, I think if there is a way to visualize it in a clearer way that really helps you bring your point across without having walls of text there, I think really would help. For example, data migration or identity flows, they, of course, take quite a bit of time to walk through, to explain, but if you can draw it at least to support the process or the flow that you're walking through, it will make it a lot easier to follow for the judges rather than just seeing a lot of words on the slide. Then think about how you will build up the story or your solution, your presentation, your answer to this RFP or this scenario question. How will this make sense? And one of the things that I see people do that I think makes it tricky to follow is if you forget to present, for example, your data model before you jump into the requirements. If you're talking about your requirements and you're saying, okay, I will create a lead for that, and it might be very difficult for the judges to follow. Okay, so and what will be the next step? What will they do with that lead, or how will this be part of the bigger picture? So I think there, make sure that you have already highlighted the building blocks before you jump into the really nitty-gritty, and then break it down. So if you look at those two pictures that I added, of course, the right one is just the same as the left one. I just took it in grayscale, but the left one really is a lot easier to follow because it breaks it down kind of in the blues, for example, our Salesforce technology that we're using. The green ones are the actors, and you see that the red cross represents the decommissioned systems, for example. So it makes it easier to kind of get at a glance an idea of what is this person talking about. So I am a very, very big fan of color coding. I think it can save you a lot of time. And again, yeah, there's a lot of information on a particular slide, but if you use some color coding to break it down again, it makes it more structured and easy to follow. Now, going to the presentation style, I think when I talk about storytelling, the business process is actually your story. So for example, you can go from customer onboarding all the way to the support that they get after they have purchased something. That is the story that you will tell, and you will tell it through particular requirements, a particular way that your customer wants to go through, or your company that you're supporting wants to set up this particular process. And then borrowing from Vinay, who is one of the best CTAs that I have worked with. So thanks so much. He really is, you should check out all his videos. So he always advised to find the North Star in a scenario. And this means is what is really important here for this company in this project? What is the thing that we have to keep in mind? Because it's not because two businesses may have a similar business project or business process, for example, that the parts which are important are the same. So for example, this company might really value having automations, a unified process, so that there's no more very, very little manual work. But another company might value the time to market. Maybe they have a very tight deadline. They want to go to market with this solution before their competitors do. So really think about what is the most important part or element for this company. And then there's this technique, and it's called sight reading. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's actually more related to music theory. And what you're actually doing is, while you are reading, especially reading out loud, you're already a few words ahead of what you're actually saying. So for example, when in music, when somebody is playing the piano and they're just playing sheet music, they haven't done this before. This is completely new to them. It may seem that they're reading and simultaneously playing the music that's on the sheet. But what they're actually normally doing is they're reading a few notes ahead and they're playing with slight delay there. And if you can train yourself into doing this for reading, then it will also help you to present in a more natural way, because then you can read what is really there. You can read your notes, for example, but you can paraphrase it. You can bring it in a way that is not going to sound as if you're just ad verbatim reading the words that are there. And then the third part, I'm borrowing for comedians. So I don't know if you watch a lot of comedy shows. I love them. And one of the things that they usually do is they will introduce a particular topic or subject. And then later on, this will become kind of like the punchline. They will get back to this, and it creates again a red thread throughout their stand-up act. And this is something that you can do. So this purposeful repetition is something that you can do to also help really ingrain certain concepts and show the judges that, well, you are presenting a puzzle that makes sense. Everything is there for a reason. And you're emphasizing this, that this solution really is complete. And when I was talking about earlier, when you have a particular requirement, such as we have here, where the customer wants to, have orders recurring at a particular basis. They want to indicate what schedule it should be. And then they should have nothing anymore to do with it. It just should happen automatically. You can use part of your data model to indicate, okay, so we will do this by having a self relationship between order. So the parent order will be the one that is constantly copied, and when, at which pace, how often, well, that is defined in the order schedule, for example. So you already introduced your data model way ahead when you did it at the first walking through of some of the major artifacts. And now you're bringing it back. You're really showing that for your requirements, this is really important. It all makes sense now. Then for the non-native speakers out there, I already mentioned that you can use some synonyms, you can use some variation. So if you want to say, okay, we're going to use Marketing Cloud, or you can also say, we will leverage Marketing Cloud to solve this or that requirement. So this makes it so that you're not constantly repeating the same words, and it makes it a bit more interesting to follow, in my opinion. Then a very good point of advice that I got from Jitendra and Varuna is curate some of the common explanations that you will likely have to give. For example, what are the benefits of using an ESB, or what is an ETL? What is the difference between the two? How does a particular identity flow go? How should you explain an integration? There are some common patterns there that it might be helpful for us to kind of find the words in advance, really think about, okay, if I have to give a short answer on what this is, how can I do this? And it will also make sure that you really understand this concept quite well, because yeah, in order to come up with that common solution or that common explanation, you have to know what is there. And then finally, I really advise you to practice with different audiences, because there might be some ways that you're saying things which make sense from your native tongue perspective. So for example, if I were to present for Dutch people, I'm sure I would make quite a bit of sense, even if I speak English, even if sometimes I'm using words or phrases that have actually nothing to do with English, but I'm just translating in my mind quite literally. And then if I present this to audiences whose native tongue might be Spanish, or, you know, they might be Indian or whatever, they might look at me in a very confused way, like, okay, what do you actually mean? What you were saying makes no sense. So practicing with different audiences will also make sure that you don't fall into the trap of using some expressions which make a lot of sense in your native tongue, but don't make sense if you translate them literally into English. Okay, so how can we bring all of that back to the actual presentation, to the actual Q&A? So first of all, in the presentation, I think it is really, really important to have this helicopter, this end-to-end view. For one, as we discussed, it will keep your audience engaged. It will make sure that, you know, they know that you have this full solution. It makes sense. And also it will improve the overall solution. So if you know how it will go end to end, then you can catch some of those hidden requirements that are there. For example, when it comes to integrations, there might not be any specific reference that your customer should also be created in the ERP system. However, later on, you do see that you have to send your orders to the ERP system. Well, your orders will not live in a vacuum. They will be attached to someone. So that is likely going to be your customer. So this means that actually you should be sending your customer to your ERP system already earlier, so that when the ordering happens, they are there, or at least when you create a first order, they should be sent along with it. However you solve it, if you think about the end-to-end, it will help you come up with a stronger solution that covers all these gaps. And the same thing can be said also on the user experience. If you think about, for example, the onboarding process, and there are a few steps that they need to walk through, maybe some validations, maybe some checks with external systems. How will you do this? Maybe your first solution is to have this registration page or have a login flow, but then they have to validate with an external system. If you then say, okay, so I will do this via a button over here or over there, then that doesn't really make sense, because weren't they in the flow before? So did they exit the flow? Are they still in there? So, you know, if you think end-to-end, it will make your solution fit, and you will not fall into the trap of having overlooked something. And then presenting artifacts is an art on its own. Some of the common ones are, of course, the actor, system landscape, data model, data migration, your governance structure, or your CI/CD setup. But usually they also have quite a bit of information that you need to walk through. And if you have a flow when you present them, for example, on your system landscape, if you can talk through, okay, so this is an external user, they will be using the mobile publisher app to access this community, and walk through your system landscape as this actor, or maybe you're walking through it from the system point of view. Either way, make sure that you have kind of a flow, and you're again not jumping from here to there, because then it will again be very, very difficult to follow. Make it as easy as you can for the judges to follow you. You have 45 minutes in a presentation. Really make sure that every minute of that, they are engaged, they pay attention, because that's how they will absorb most of what you are presenting. And in the end, you know, most of what you're presenting will come through and be kind of stuck there. So you might waste less time in Q&A to clarify elements you might have discussed already. Think of requirements as pieces of the puzzle. And here again, sight reading can help. If you look at these requirements, there's a lot going on. So this is not that easy to present. But in the end, what is there? Well, some countries will have suppliers and they have to provide particular permits. And these need to be validated against a government system. Now, some of those government systems might be able to be integrated with, others are actually still relying on email or fax. So we will have to make sure that we can create a manual task for those which are not supporting integrations. And for those who are supporting integrations, we might have to have different types of protocols, different types of technologies to deal with. So that's where we'll introduce middleware, for example. And that way you're, again, not reading out loud, but you're bringing it as a bigger whole. With regard to Q&A, I don't know if you've seen some of Johan Forman's life coaching. I did one with him and it was really a lot of fun. And he talks about this 5-finger method, where how do you make sure that you provided the information that you needed? So you need to make sure that, for example, if someone asks you a question, what is the question? So what is the requirement that they are talking about? What is your solution? Did you make any assumptions there? Did you consider any alternatives? And in the end, what is your justification for going with what you are proposing? So this is, again, a technique that I think can really help to make sure that you answer the question in a very clear, complete, yet concise manner. And then finally on the Q&A, again, really make sure that you understand the question. And when in doubt, ask to rephrase. A common misconception, I think, in Q&A is that the judges are there to kind of grill you or, you know, put you in difficult situations. That is not my experience at all. My experience is that they really do try to understand where your solution is coming from, pick out some points where there might be something that doesn't make sense or that might just be blatantly wrong, and give you the opportunity to correct this and to walk through this thinking process. How did you get to this? And how are you going to fix it if it doesn't work? So again, you'll have to likely adapt under shifting assumptions or requirements. This is something you have to get used to. So in the Q&A, as if you are a judge, or, you know, if someone is judging you, really make sure and ask them to sometimes just throw in things that are not in the scenario, just to keep you on your toe, to show that you can work under this pressure, that you are flexible, but that also you are reliable. You will not crumble, and keep it short and concise. So that was it for me. I hope it was interesting. And if you have any questions, yeah, so let me hear them. I hope I can provide a meaningful answer.
It's really great. I did not see any question into the chat window, but let me allow the participant to unmute themselves and ask a question directly with you.
Yeah, great.
In the meantime, I see one question in the chat window from the staff. How important it is to use various other product offering by Salesforce, for example, using MuleSoft, Marketing Cloud, Tableau in your proposed solution. Related question, do you recommend it to get hands-on experience on the third-party products?
I think that's a very good question. So I think some hands-on experience with particular tools, or at least getting a grip of what can they do, such as it doesn't necessarily have to be MuleSoft, but it might be good if you become a bit more acquainted there, because then you know, okay, MuleSoft can do this. So we know that this middleware will be able to support this. So in that sense, I think it is useful. I don't think you need to be an expert on MuleSoft, Marketing Cloud, and some of the other products that Salesforce has, but it is good to know some of the core capabilities that they can do. Because if something comes up, if there is a marketing requirement, for example, you really want to know that you can answer this question, whether it is with a Salesforce product or an App Exchange one. The judges, I don't think, will create a big fuss about it, but just make sure that you have an idea that what you're proposing, if you say, I will go with an App Exchange product for that, that there will be an App Exchange product for that, that you're not proposing that for something that is so complex that there might not actually be one. So do browse and do find some common ones. So for example, document generation, I think is a very good one to definitely at least look at and understand how it works. I hope it provided an answer there.
There is another question. How do you balance explaining why you did not choose option versus what you choose? Would waste lots of time?
That's a very good one. So indeed, you don't want to waste too much time. So with one sentence, just saying, I didn't go for form assembly, for example, because web delete was sufficient and I think it can cover all the needs. That's it. You don't want to spend too much time. You just, in some cases, you might want to mention that you know that there are alternatives there. Another example could be, let's say you have some product configuration that needs to happen. We know that Salesforce, of course, has CPQ, which can do a lot of complex product configuration, but maybe your client doesn't need that. Maybe they only need to have a custom object which can support product options, for example, and that's the only part they need. So then you might say, okay, I did consider CPQ, but considering the scope and the complexity that they need, I think having a custom object will suffice, and we don't need to go with a bigger project or a bigger solution here.
So there is another question. Do we need to learn entire sales and service data model point to point?
I think I would highly advise this, to be honest, because I don't think you need to necessarily know all the fields, etc. But I do think that you need to know more or less how they are structured, because from my point of view, for the review board, there are 3 products, sales, service, and experience cloud, that Salesforce considers core. They really expect you to know and understand these products and the solutions that you propose. So I would definitely, so I would propose that you dive in as well.
We will have a design authority to set the guidelines.
And one more question, like, do we have to have hands-on draw artifact, or we can create the artifact digitally? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so this is always evolving. So I know that Salesforce is sometimes changing which tools you can use in the review board. So it's always best to check the review guide to see what you can or cannot do. I am a bit of a control freak, so I wanted to make sure that I drew mine by hand, just because if there was, I had a virtual board. So if there was, for example, some bad connection, some lag because you're working on a remote computer, I didn't want to have that delay me. So that's why I drew them by hand. But I know that there are other people who did the virtual board with artifacts they drew in their Google Slide document, and that they did perfectly fine. So that is also an option. Both are acceptable.
Next question, for the CTA preparation, does one need to know hands-on of Salesforce platform technology like Heroku architecture and Node.js/Ruby?
Not necessarily, but you do need to know that, what value they could bring, what problems they could solve. Again, I think it's just good to know that there is such a thing as a platform as a service, and that in some cases you might not be willing to go for certain solutions and bring them into Salesforce. So you might have to rely on external solutions such as Heroku to, for example, do the heavy lifting, or you can potentially use them to consolidate information from different other external systems. There are really good use cases. So I think it's important to understand those rather than have hands-on experience.
One last question. On the communication, getting the feedback of presentation too fast, speaking, especially, is that matter of practice?
Yeah, and I think this is also a matter of nerves. So I think I'm slightly better at this than I was about a year ago, but this is something that I have as well. When I get nervous and I have to present, I really tend to speak like a high-speed train. I keep going and I stumble over my own words. So there it is indeed also something that you can practice. It's something that you can work on, and just take sometimes a break. It's fine. This is a very good tip that I got from a lot of people on the journey, is just sometimes if you feel like a bit overwhelmed, it's fine to just take a sip of water. You don't even have to actually take a sip if you don't need it, but just taking a moment to breathe and then continue can help really calm your nerves and make sure that you continue in not that high speed pace, because talking too fast is also not, you don't gain anything. If they lost your train of thought, if they don't understand you anymore, you're just wasting your time, which you don't want, of course.
Thank you so much, Lilith, for such a great session and lots of information and tips from your experience that will be definitely help to our audience. And don't forget to check our Salesforce CTA playlist. Now we have more than 40 plus sessions over there that will be definitely help you to learn around different topic, like more technical topic, non-technical topic, experience. So don't forget to check about that. If you are watching this as a recording on our YouTube, I will be share the link into the description part. Don't forget to check that.